You had me at Jello, Jello. You had me at Jello. You had me at Jello. Oh, you had me at Jello. Playing the cello has so many pluses. It never grows old. Give it one listen, you'll see what the fuss. Well, hello, everybody. This is an interview on an experiment that I get to present the research on, along with co-author Dr. Josh Albrecht, who's with me today, and a couple other people, Jeremy Porpered and Brian Bell. How are you doing, Dr. Albrecht?
I'm fine.
That's good. That's good. I imagine, so basically how this came about is that a colleague, good colleague and friend, Mike Betker at UW-Whitewater, in the same college, but the communication department. He's with the Whitewater Advertising Association that helps me out with the cello chats and other things. I told him the story of this research, and he said, "Oh, that's really interesting. You have to do an interview on it." And I think he's right. So here we are. But first of all, would you tell your story of kind of your musical background? And for any and all current and former Whitewater students, don't leave out the stuff about the two enrollments, twice enrolling in Whitewater.
Right. Yeah. So I started out in high school. I loved music, but I also loved computer programming. So I started off at college at Whitewater, and they didn't have a computer programming degree at the time. This was 2000. So I was a computer information systems major and music minor. And I really loved my music classes, and I had music theory with Dr. Whitcomb here, and it was a great kind of an eye-opening experience for me because my whole life I loved music, but I didn't really understand that there was anything to to really kind of dig down into in terms of details. I thought it was just this mystical experience that washed over your subconscious and left you enriched. And here I am sitting in theory class, and wow, this. I mean, I probably marveled over the circle of fifths for 3 or 4 days, just relationships between the keys and stuff. So, anyways, I really fell in love with my music theory classes and my music experiences in general at Whitewater. But Whitewater didn't have a computer science degree, so I transferred to UW-Madison. And while I was there, I double majored in music and in computer science. And I loved my computer science degree, but I had a harder time with the music degree. It was a little bit more of an experimental theory program there, and there was a lot of influence, a lot of a focus on the grad students there. So I decided to drop the computer science degree altogether and transfer back to Whitewater and finish up. Whitewater had this really cool degree at the time. Do you guys still have it? The history theory degree?
No, now it's a theory composition degree.
Oh, okay. Well, I did the music history, music theory degree, and I took composition lessons, and I had experiences. I took Schenkerian analysis with you, and I took history of Renaissance music, and I mean it was a really unique undergrad experience. Did a lot of independent study work with you, and read Helmholtz, and learned a lot about early experimental work with music cognition and consonance and dissonance in particular. And from there, I went on to get a master's degree at the University of Texas at Austin, and then I spent a couple of years working for a nonprofit called the Navigators, and then I went to Ohio State. While I was at Texas, I read Sweet Anticipation by David Giron, and I thought, who writes like this? Who thinks like this? It's so clear and insightful. So I thought I had to meet this guy. So I went out there and interviewed with him, and I had just been to Oregon because I got accepted to the PhD program out there too. And I thought, oh, I really hope that I end up going to Oregon. But then I met David Huron, and I thought, oh, I can't not study with this guy. So I ended up picking Ohio State and moved out there and did my doctorate degree. And then from there, my first theory job was at the University of Mary Hardin-Baylor in Texas from 2012 to 2019. And in 2019, right before the pandemic, I moved to Kent State University, where I've been teaching for the last 4 years. And right now I'm in transition on my way to the University of Iowa to teach at that program. So it's been kind of a journey across the country and through academia.
Excellent. Now, let's see. A couple of things, if I may add to the story, that particularly starting in that year when you were still at Madison, but knew you were switching back to Whitewater, I could not keep you with enough books. You were, had contacted me. Well, wow, this is great. What's something else? And I'd get to go through my library and go, oh, he's gonna love this one, and he definitely needs to read this one at some point. And we'd get together and talk through. You just were going through just at an incredible rate, which is great because there's so much stuff out there. It's really helps to get that perspective. And I have to say, even if in your experience it was the book you read by Huron, I remember mentioning David Huron to you, and you hear it's just kind of one of those people that everything he writes is so interesting. And the way he teaches too, I got to go to one of the cognition events that they had there at the Ohio State University, and he's brilliant to listen to speaking as well.
Yeah.
Something else, and you are also trained in humdrum,
right?
Would you tell a little bit about what that is?
Sure. Yeah. So again, this is David Huron. I feel like David Huron's got his hands in basically just about everything, but there's a long history of computational musicology. Decades, really going back even to even before computers, the sort of empirical musicology corpus study approach. But so from the 60s, some big projects got going, but there were massive problems with implementation. And so in the 80s, David Huron thought about some of the ways in which the field could really be supplemented, and started working on encoding music in a symbolic form. And so it's basically humdrum is a set of tools that analyze text files in a particular format. And the most common format that humdrum tools work on is kern format, which is basically the logical kernel of a musical score. And so anything that you want to encode about a musical score, you can encode in kern format, and it's in a text representation. And so then what humdrum does is it allows you to search very quickly giant databases of music. And so you can answer really interesting questions, questions that it would have taken scholars a whole career to answer in the past before computational musicology. You can just type in a few keystrokes and get an answer quickly. So,
yeah, amazing. And you keep wondering what questions are just beyond our current thought, that if you but formulated the right question, it'd be a really cool aha.
uh-huh. Yeah, and yeah, it's interesting. I feel like one of the most powerful contributions that music scholarship offers, especially empirical musicology, is really good stories. And if you can come up with an experimental paradigm that's really clever, a lot of times you can uncover some really interesting things about music and tell a really good story with it. And I mean, there's this sort of like false dichotomy between empirical methods and more traditional humanities scholarship in music, and I don't see them as in conflict at all. I see them as trying to get in different ways to the same questions. And we want to get these sort of these stories that converge together from multiple different methods and all kind of point in the same direction.
All right, and then the moment you got to Kent State, you started a music cognition lab. Would you talk about that a little bit too?
Sure, yeah. So I called it the Interdisciplinary Music Cognition Lab. I'm not sure quite how interdisciplinary it ended up getting, but we have people from different disciplines within music performance and music education and music theory, and but then also we've got folks from. Right now, I've got a student in the lab who is a graphic design, video game design student. I've had English majors in there before, people who've done cognitive linguistics, and psychology majors. Of course, we've got a few of those, ethnomusicology as well. So yeah, it's basically a rough group of people that are all kind of interested in using empirical methods to answer music questions. But there's not a whole lot of, I guess, a motley crew. Not a whole lot of it was from all sorts of different places. And since I got to Kent State in 2019, I found a lot of students who are really interested in this sort of thing. Have been able to recruit some students that were interested in empirical musicology, and we've been meeting lab meetings about once a week for the last 4 years, doing research projects. I've done, I think, over 15 projects with over 20 students in the lab in the last 4 years.
Nice.
And hopefully in the final phases of getting some of them published too. So
yeah,
I think we'll get 3 or 4 of them out in the next few months, hopefully.
Terrific. And then to set up a little bit of the story on my end too, I started here at Whitewater at fall of '99, and the dean at the time, John Heyer, I remember him saying that I could divide my research/creative activities however I want between cello and music theory. But then he reminded me, he said, but keep the cello studio full, So it was funny that year. I don't know if I told you this before. I think maybe I did. That year, there were 3 jobs in the country that wanted specifically a cellist/music theorist in Florida and Pennsylvania and Wisconsin. And obviously I got the one in Wisconsin. And so, I mean, with a statement like that definitely made me favor doing research/creative activity much, much more heavily in the cello world than in theory. I'd occasionally get either a paper presentation or a publication, but they were invariably offshoots of my dissertation, early on. And so I'd just keep a running tally of certain questions that would arise when I'd read articles. Oh, they didn't, they only did this with simultaneous sounds, or wait, they didn't add this variable in there as well, and just these sorts of questions. And so I'd say about maybe 6 years ago, I tried putting together an experiment of my own. But boy, the numerical and statistical end of things is complex. So then, to make a long story short, kind of tried reaching out to what do they call it? The hearing lab here at Whitewater. And I mean, we just kind of weren't on the same wavelength, I suppose, would be the metaphor that is apt. So then I approached you. I thought, well, maybe Dr. Albrecht with his lab. And so then we did a Zoom meeting where we talked about, was it 5 or 6 possible questions? And the one we ended up with is the one we've been working on for the past 3 years.
Yeah, it takes a while.
Yeah. So do you want to, from your perspective, talk about what this question is and how we set it up?
Sure. Yeah, and I hope we're almost done with that. 3 years is a long time, but not an unusual amount of time, unfortunately. We're pretty close to getting the article written up, and we'll be presenting it in Tokyo here in about a month. But yeah, so I think the way that I think about this is really well, I mean, what we're describing the article as is investigating the effect of tempo on tuning. But really, I think it's fruitful to think about it in terms of how we hear and different ways, different modes, different channels of hearing. And the language that we've been using is sort of a melodic hearing versus a harmonic hearing. And it's all about tuning. So we're really asking this question about does the mode in which we hear music, either melodically or harmonically, affect the preferences that we have for tuning, or what we think of what we hear as in tune? And a lot of this, I think, was driven by this observation that Pablo Casals made decades ago. That he talked about the intonation of pitches being dependent on the speed of the music, and so specifically when it comes to tuning up the third of a chord, especially when it's the leading tone in a dominant harmony, that third of the chord is notoriously difficult to tune, or with equal temperament. It doesn't sing in the same way that a just intoned third would. And the cool thing about, of course, the cello and string instruments is that you have complete control over how intervals are tuned. And so he advocated, and I'm not a cellist, so correct me if I'm off here, but I think he advocated for in the leading tone, moving up to tonic, a melodic sort of hearing where we're going to tune the leading tone sharper to really dig into that tendency that it has to want to resolve upward to the tonic. But then he makes this really intriguing comment that, well, you don't want to do that when the music's too slow. And the reason for that, of course, is that if the chord hangs for a long time, that leading tone is going to be rubbing. It's going to have beats against the root of the chord. And so in that context, you're going to want, if what we're listening to is a harmonic channel of hearing, and we're hearing that note against its harmony rather than melodic implications, we're going to want that note to be tuned up justly. And so it's going to be lower than when we're at a faster tempo. So that led us to think, okay, well, what is the effect of tempo then on specifically that leading tone resolution?
Yeah, well said, well described too. The only thing I'd add is, in addition to the Casals quote, I find it also very interesting, the diagrams, both from the 18th century, admittedly from early versus later in the 18th century, of exactly where to put your finger on a violin fingerboard for various pitches. And the one that has G sharp above A flat, and the other that has G sharp below A flat, without them acknowledging anything about why some sources would put that the other way around, or why they prefer that particular order. But I mean, things like that, once you get to the world of empirical music theory, that just begs to be investigated.
Yeah. So the approach that we used was we wanted to try to look at music in different contexts. Obviously, we wanted to vary the speed, but we also were curious. I mean, there's a lot going on with music, right? And the way that we think about it is influenced by all sorts of things. And you can imagine that tempo is just one factor among many. And so we wanted to try to disentangle as many of those factors as we could. So we presented music to participants in three different textures. One was a monophonic texture all by itself. So we took little 3-note melodies, basically just the T-do resolution, that leading tone resolution, preceded either by a step above or a step below, or a third leap above or a third leap below, because we thought, well, maybe there's some influence about how we approach the leading tone too. And then we presented those melodies, those 3-note melodies, with a little bit more context too. So 5-note melodies as well, just in case there needed to be a little bit more establishment of tonic before that leading tone effect would be relevant. So we did this in monophonic melodies to sort of force people to hear in a melodic channel, right? There's no harmonic content other than that which is implied by the melody and by the overtones, I suppose. And then we also wanted to do just a harmonic context. So we provided just that dominant chord where the leading tone then would be, variably tuned. And then what we did was we were really interested in this third mixed condition, which was a harmonized melodies condition. So we took the melodies from the first monophonic phase and we harmonized them. And that was the one that we thought, well, okay, maybe if it's switching between a monophonic or melodic versus harmonic hearing, at various tempos, maybe this is the condition where we'll see these things, sorts of things change. And so we took that leading tone and we detuned it all sorts of different ways. We had 5 different tunings. Equal temperament, which is sharper than just intonation. We use just intonation, which is sweet, a sweet intonation with the chord. And then we took that third even sharper than equal temperament for Pythagorean tuning, which was an old form of tuning that kind of treated the third as a dissonance just because of how out of tune it was. And then we went really extreme and had an extremely sharp and an extremely flat version of those, which I think to any listener would sound out of place, and for most listeners, I suppose, yeah. And so then we presented these at different tempi, right? So we had a range of tempos going all the way down to 28 beats attacks really per minute, all the way up to 288 attacks per minute, beats per minute.
Right. So slower than adagio on the metronome and faster than prestissimo.
Yeah. And so then the theory was that as the tempo got faster, especially in the monophonic condition or in a harmonized melody condition, we'd expect participants to be more and more okay with sharper, in fact, prefer sharper intonations of that leading tone. If that faster tempo is sort of forcing them or encouraging them to hear melodically rather than harmonically. And at the slower tempos, it's going to be really important for them to have that justly intoned third. So we expected more acceptance of the just intonation third at slower tempos.
And then when we crunched the numbers,
yeah,
it was so disappointing at first to just see not any really of the expected tempo effects that I was thinking would be there, but a really substantial effect of those 3 contexts, whether we just played them a chord or just played them a melody or did the mixed condition.
Yeah.
So we want to talk about the results a little?
Yeah, sure. So I think the most important thing to say, the strongest effect that we saw was simply just an effect of, maybe we could call it a mere exposure effect, right? So the mere exposure literature basically posits that the more we're exposed to a stimulus, the easier it is to process, and so the more we prefer it. And most of the music we listen to is tuned in equal temperament. And so regardless of the condition, regardless of the tempo, regardless of the texture, basically equal temperament always won. That was pretty disappointing because we were expecting to see just intonation really be preferred, especially in that harmony only condition at slower tempos especially. We really expected to see just intonation. But as it turns out, people really just like equal temperament. And I think it's probably the best explanation, is just because that's what people hear most often.
Though there might be also, I'm trying to remember who the author is. Somebody tries to make a case for the fact that based on the size of the just noticeable difference, that equal temperament seems maybe to be kind of in that sweet spot between the harmonic ideal and the melodic ideal too, where you get a little bit of extra scooching of the note over towards the voice leading implications, but not so much that it's within our, discernible amount to tell that it's, at the expense of sounding nicely in tune.
Yeah, there's a lot of empirical evidence to suggest that we hear categorically. So it's a D until it's not a D anymore, right? And if you make it a little sharper, it's a little bit of a sharp D, but it's still a D. And then at some point it becomes an E flat or a D sharp. And maybe that's what's going on, is that equal temperament is still nicely fits within that category, so close enough to fit in that category, but not violate, the beat or something. So yeah.
But then
is that yeah. So what's cool about it is that you can actually look at the times when just intonation wins, or the times when Pythagorean intonation wins. And so the question is, uh, even though equal temperament is generally always preferred, it's not always preferred. There are times when just intonation beats it. Even though equal temperament beats just intonation more often, sometimes people choose just intonation. And so under what conditions can we see those things tweak a little bit? And here, more in the weeds, we start to see the effects that we're predicting. So just intonation is chosen as more in tune at significantly higher rates at slower tempi, just as we hypothesized. And the faster the tempo goes, the less often just intonation is chosen as the correct intonation. Also, what's interesting is that sharp intonations get I mean they never are selected very often, but they're selected more often at faster tempos than at slower tempos, which does suggest that maybe either they're so fast that people have no idea what they're doing, they're just clicking randomly, which is possible, or people think, yeah, it's not so bad, and when you look at when sharp wins, a lot of times when it's paired up against flat, because these things were always presented in pairs. And so it was a forced choice. Here's one performance, here's another performance. Sometimes sharp was pitted against flat. And in those contexts, sharp begins to win more often at faster tempos. You don't see the same thing with flat. So
No.
if it's just a matter of, I have no idea what I'm doing, is going too fast, you'd expect flat and sharp to both increase. But you don't see that. The advantage goes to sharp. And then of course, flat, at the slowest tempos has more at the slowest tempos, I'm sorry, under texture conditions. So when flat is just presented in a chord, it is less unacceptable than what's presented melodically in a monophonic context or even in a harmonized melody context. And so there's a huge decrease, even though it's never very preferable. There's a huge decrease when you actually put it in a melody. People think, oh, that flat really doesn't work in that context. So It does seem like there's some effect that's happening. It's just that our preferences for intonation are more impacted by other factors than by tempo, but tempo is not irrelevant.
Yeah. And when you look at these results, you almost can't help but think, well, what if we'd have asked the question this way, or what if we'd have included this parameter or altered it in a particular way? I mean, it's like we might have gotten somewhat different results if our sharp and flat hadn't been quite so. I mean, we intentionally wanted to kind of find boundaries. Okay, well, let's go far enough that we're sure we're including extremes. And there may be some other kind of just like slightly above Pythagorean or below just that might score distinctly better than those extremes did. And likewise, context wise, we could try different melodic contexts. And I mean, there's always the question of whether to try sine tones versus complex waves as well. And what are I'm just kind of curious, what are some of the other questions the results of the previous experiments lead you to want to ask next?
No, that's a good question. Yeah, I think timbre is a much more important factor than we often give it credit for. And we ended up using this electronic organ timbre because it didn't have a decay to it, and because there was some amplitude phasing, so it kind of wobbled in and out. And we thought that might be helpful for listeners to not necessarily lock into phase as a way of trying to figure out the tuning thing. But yeah, it would be interesting to see what would happen with sine tones. I would imagine that intonation differences between the different intonations wouldn't be as strong with sine tones because we wouldn't have as much data to lock into. Yeah, and 288 is pretty fast, but it's not as fast as it could be. I think it would be interesting to see what would happen if these things really went by in the blip of an ear, right? If it
or conversely, 28, if it were an actual something like 2 seconds long,
yeah,
to where you really had a chance to go, well, maybe just a little bit. No, evaluate it. 28 could be slower.
yeah, that's right. We also tried to present these things in context that minimized scale degree 3 and 6, or minimized those notes. The context always presented in equal temperament, and I suspect that probably had an influence on the results that we found, why equal temperament was so preferred. We did try to minimize that, but you kind of wonder, like, well, if we had come up with a preparation for the stimulus that didn't so heavily tip the scales in favor of equal temperament, would we see more variation in the results?
Yeah, that's a hard one to figure out.
Yeah, I remember us puzzling over that for months, trying to figure out how to present this list to people. Yeah.
And then just at least briefly, because I think it's interesting too, if you would maybe talk a little bit about the sheer number of musical examples generated, and maybe also the program with which you created all of these. I found it very interesting, and I was lost very quickly early on with the behind the scenes of the program that you used.
Right. Well, I have to give all credit to Jeremy Poperat on that, because he's the one that designed all the stimuli. He used Reaper, and so Reaper, it has a lot of shortcuts to be able to copy and paste massive amounts of things with small differences very quickly. But basically, I mean, we wanted to try to keep listeners from getting too locked into any particular key, and so we used 10 different keys, starting from middle C and going up to up a fourth and down a fourth, basically. So I guess it's 11 keys. And we randomly picked a key for each stimulus, but that meant that we needed to have 5 different tunings at 6 different tempos for 11 different keys in 3 different textures with 3-note and 5-note melodies. I think it ended up being something like 5,260 total stimuli that we used. And a lot of these were treated as random variables. We didn't actually control the distribution of these things, but we wanted to make sure that we controlled pairing up the two. So we want to make sure that every intonation at every tempo condition and every texture condition had at least one comparison. And so we did that with, I think it was 91 participants or something like that.
Yeah. It was a lot of data.
A lot of data. Well, almost too much.
And then another thing I want to go back to briefly, at least, is your comment early on, for example, about being dazzled, or whatever the verb you used for the circle of fifths. And I like even how you kind of looked up like it's a constellation, the circle of fifths. And it is funny because, I mean, we could say there's sort of 2 types of musicians: the ones who they want music to stay kind of this spiritual thing, and maybe aren't particularly interested in the quantitative or the theoretical stuff. And then there are those of us who are, I mean, just our mind is blown by when we realize, oh, wait, that's how that works. This is that connection. But you could even break it down further and say that there are various aspects within theory that, kind of intrigue various people the most. So I think another one that you and I find intriguing are things like the emotional associations, just everything from like historical affects associated with various keys and things like that. But for me, certainly the first time I ran across even papers that these days you wouldn't necessarily put dead center of the body of works on melodic versus harmonic hearing, but there's a number of them, even from quite some time ago, that acknowledge that it's as though it's in two almost entirely different ways that we process musical sounds under certain circumstances. So it's like even things like octave equivalence being an automatic thing with harmonic applications. If we just sound a C against a C at the same time, that's the harmonic channel, and it always applies octave equivalence. Whereas in a melodic sense, sometimes you have to proactively apply it. It's not natural to that type of processing musical pitch. And so in a way, it's like setting up these three conditions that we did and finding where our results, more than anything, supported the significance of that kind of what we're calling the textural context. Just all the more, fascinates me about this distinction, because in our mind, it's one experience, right? The music is one experience. We don't compartmentalize them.
Yeah.
And then the other thing is, it just leads me to want to do a lot more experiments on where that divide is in various situations and how that can help us to either understand various concepts or to teach them to students. Things like, you think how body mapping, once somebody understands how a shoulder works, it's easier for them to figure out, oh, okay, so then I don't want to do that, I want to do this. And likewise, if we can understand how the ear and the brain are processing pitch information, I think that would help us, lead us to, further understanding and realizations as well.
Yeah, that's well put.
Thanks.
Yeah, and certainly anybody who teaches oral skills knows the difference that students struggle with between harmonic and melodic hearing, right? It's a lot easier to lock in on a harmonic interval of an octave, but if you ask students to sing an octave, sometimes it can be all over the map.
Mm-hmm. Or a number of things. They just have a particular harmony that in root position where the brain just can integrate those things, but then when it's either inverted or it's played out melodically, then it just, they have to work to connect the dots.
Yeah.
So what are you looking forward to most about Tokyo at the end of August?
Yeah, well, it'll be a great cultural experience for sure. It'll be fun to, I think, you'll be there, right? And Elena's going to be there, another student in my lab, and Jeremy's going to be there, another co-author on this paper. So it'll be great to, sort of one last hurrah with the Kent State Music Cognition Lab before heading over to Iowa. And of course, there'll be a lot of really interesting research and melting pot. We did a Society for Music Perception and Cognition conference last summer in person, but we're really just kind of getting back to in-person conferences, and it's such a hole in academic life because this is where the most vibrancy of sharing ideas happens, and I always get so inspired for next research projects by what I see at conferences.
Yeah, I'm very much looking forward to. And they have a nice, we're finally getting to find out kind of the rest of the details about not just the keynote speakers, but some of the other talks that are going to be there. And it's going to be, it's hard to know just how much you're going to get inspiration for future ideas and projects and just rabbit holes to go down from just what is it, a 4 or 5 day conference?
Yeah, that's right.
All right. Well, thanks so much, Josh. It's always fun to talk to you, and hopefully this like just kind of summarizing, encapsulating this rather large project. In some respects, we could have ended it last year. That's when we got a couple of national presentations on the research. But then, of course, once this international conference accepted it, okay, we're happy to stay with it for another run. Yeah, so that'll be fun. Very much looking forward to the end of August. And if any viewers of this have any questions at all and want to nerd out on these sorts of questions, please feel free to drop us a line.
Definitely. Yeah.
All right. Well, best of luck with the transition to University of Iowa. You'll be a lot closer to Southern Wisconsin where I am. So I'm excited
That's right.
about
Yeah.
that.
Definitely.
Take care, Josh.
You too. Bye.
You had me at Cello, Cello. You had me at Cello. You had me at Cello. Oh, you had me at Cello. Playing the cello has so many pluses.